We got an old farmhouse for free, but it came with a set of unbreakable rules. We thought it was the deal of a lifetime, a solution to all our problems, a way to finally escape the city and the debt that was crushing us. We were wrong. The rules weren't just the strange habits of an old woman, they were a lock on a cage. And we were about to find out what happened when you let the monster out. This is the story of how our dream home became our prison. The lawyer's office was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt expensive. The air tasted of old paper and lemon polish. Liam sat beside me, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy that I could feel through the plush chair. He was trying to look calm, but I could see the hope in his eyes, a desperate, flickering thing we both shared. We were drowning. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the slow, suffocating way of late-night bills and whispered arguments over money. Every month, the tide of our debt rose a little higher, and we were running out of air. Then the letter came. It was from a law firm we'd never heard of, informing us that a distant great-aunt, a woman named Alara Vance, had passed away. I didn't even know I had a great-aunt Alara. The letter was vague, requesting our presence for the reading of her will. We almost didn't go. It felt like a mistake, a clerical error that would only lead to more disappointment. But a tiny, stubborn part of us, the part that still believed in miracles, made us drive the 2 hours to this quiet, polished office. The lawyer, a man with a kind face and tired eyes, slid a thick envelope across the desk. As the last living relatives of Alara Vance, he began, his voice soft. You are the sole inheritors of her estate. I held my breath. William's leg stopped bouncing. The estate, the lawyer explained, consisted of a single property, a farmhouse nestled on 50 acres of land in the remote countryside. There was no money, no hidden fortune, just the house. But the lawyer saved the most important detail for last. There are no liens, no back taxes, and no mortgage, he said, looking at us over the rim of his glasses. The property is yours, free and clear. Free. The word echoed in the silent room. It was a word we hadn't heard in years. It felt foreign, unreal. I looked at Liam, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the tension in his shoulders release. A slow smile spread across his face, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. This was it. This was our escape. A whole house, all to ourselves. No more rent, no more fighting over which bills to pay this month. We could sell it, maybe. Or, better yet, we could live in it. We could finally start over. We thanked the lawyer, our voices thick with an emotion we couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of relief and disbelief. As we were getting up to leave, the lawyer cleared his throat. There is one more thing, he said, his tone shifting slightly. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a single, folded sheet of yellowed paper. It looked ancient, the creases worn and soft. Your great-aunt was very specific that you receive this with the deed. He slid it across the table. It felt different from the other documents, warmer, almost alive in my hand. This, I would later realize, was the moment the lock on the cage was set. This was the moment we walked willingly into our prison, thinking it was a palace. We were so focused on the dream of a new life that we never stopped to ask why the cage was open in the first place. The drive to the farmhouse was filled with a giddy, almost childish excitement. We blasted music from the car speakers. The windows rolled down, letting the warm summer air whip through the car. It felt like the first day of a vacation, a permanent vacation from our old lives. The city with its noise and its endless demands faded behind us, replaced by rolling green hills and wide open skies. For the first time in years, we felt like we could breathe. We found the house at the end of a long, winding dirt road, flanked by ancient, sprawling oak trees. It was beautiful, more beautiful than we could have imagined. It was a classic 2-story farmhouse with a wide, welcoming porch and windows that seemed to glitter in the afternoon sun. It was old, certainly, but it had been built with a kind of simple, sturdy grace that made it feel timeless. The paint was peeling in a few places, and the garden was overgrown with wildflowers, but it didn't look neglected. It looked asleep, waiting. As we stepped out of the car, a profound silence settled over us. It wasn't an empty silence, but a living one, filled with the gentle hum of insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the kind of peace we had been dreaming of. Well, Liam said, his voice hushed with awe. What do you think? I didn't have the words. I just squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with a joy so pure it almost hurt. This was ours, all of it. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, our laughter echoing through the empty rooms. The inside of the house was just as charming as the outside. It was filled with old, handcrafted furniture, covered in white dust cloths like sleeping ghosts. The floors were wide planks of dark, polished wood, and a grand stone fireplace dominated the living room. It was a house that had been loved, a house that had been lived in. We felt it in the very air. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the floor, I remembered the strange, yellowed piece of paper the lawyer had given us. I had tucked it into my pocket, half forgotten in the excitement of the day. I pulled it out now, my curiosity piqued. Liam came and stood beside me, and together we read the 4 rules written in the shaky, spidery hand of our mysterious great-aunt Alara. 1. Never leave a door open after sunset. 2WO. All mirrors are forbidden. 3. Sunday supper must be served at the dining table at 6 p.m. sharp. 4. Do not listen to the whispers. We looked at each other, and then we laughed. It was so absurd, so wonderfully eccentric. What do you think that's all about? Liam asked, a grin playing on his lips. I have no idea, I said, shaking my head. Maybe she was just a little odd. We dismissed it easily, a funny little story to tell our friends, if we had any friends who would drive this far out into the country to visit. It was a quirk, a relic of a lonely old woman's strange habits, nothing more. As darkness fell, we made a show of closing and locking every door in the house, a playful nod to the first rule. We were just beginning a new adventure, and we were blissfully, dangerously unaware that the rules were not a game. They were a shield, and we had just picked it up, with no idea what we were fighting. The first night in the farmhouse felt like playing house. We were 2 kids who had stumbled upon a life that wasn't ours, a life of quiet and space and the gentle creak of old wood. We ordered pizza from a place in the nearest town, a 20-minute drive away, and ate it sitting on the floor of the living room, our voices echoing in the high ceiling space. The house was still and silent around us, a sleeping giant that we hadn't yet woken. We were giddy, drunk on the sheer possibility of it all. This was our home. The thought was so new, so fragile, that I was almost afraid to touch it. As the last light of day faded from the sky, turning the windows into dark, reflective squares, Liam stood up and stretched. Well, he said, a playful glint in his eye, time to follow the rules. He walked through the house, making a grand ceremony of closing each and every door, the front door, the back door, the door to the little used study. Each click of the latch was loud in the silence. I followed behind him, laughing, feeling a little foolish. It was a game, a silly ritual to mark our first night. We were just humoring the ghost of a woman we'd never met. But when the last door was closed, a different kind of silence fell over the house. It was heavier, more profound. The air grew still, and the house seemed to be holding its breath. We went to bed early, exhausted from the long day. The bedroom was large, with a tall window that looked out over the dark, rolling fields. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, casting just enough light to turn the world outside into a landscape of shadows. I lay in the strange bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the groan of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind in the eaves, and then I heard it, a soft, faint sound, like the rustle of dry leaves. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained my ears, trying to place it. It was a whisper, a series of soft, sibilant sounds that I couldn't quite make out. It was like listening to a conversation in another room, the words just beyond the edge of hearing. "Liam," I whispered, my voice tight, "do you hear that?" He was quiet for a moment, listening. "It's just the house settling," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "It's an old house, Chloe. It's going to make noises." I knew he was right. It was the logical explanation. But the sound didn't feel logical. It felt intentional. It rose and fell in a steady rhythm, like breathing. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, trying to force myself to believe it was just the wind, or the pipes, or any of the other mundane explanations that my rational mind was so desperately searching for. But the whispers continued, a soft, insistent murmur in the deep, dark quiet of our new home. It was the house's first secret, its first warning, and we, in our blissful ignorance, chose not to listen. The next few days were a blur of activity. We started the slow, satisfying work of making the house our own. We unpacked boxes, scrubbed floors, and aired out rooms that had been closed up for years. The work was hard, but it was good work, the kind that made you feel like you were building something real. With every box we emptied, we were unpacking the pieces of our new life, and the weight of our old one began to feel like a distant memory. It was during this process that I discovered the second rule was not just a suggestion. I had a small antique hand mirror that I adored. It was a gift from my grandmother, with a silver handle and intricate carvings of vines and flowers. It was one of the few beautiful things I owned, a small piece of my past that I had carried with me through all the hard years. I had wrapped it carefully in a sweater and packed it in one of the last boxes. When I finally unwrapped it, my heart sank. The glass was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks running through the once smooth surface. I knew it was foolish to be so upset over a broken object, but it felt like a bad omen, a small crack in the perfect facade of our new life. I carefully gathered the pieces of broken glass and threw them away, a strange sense of finality settling over me. Liam, seeing my disappointment, put his arms around me. "We'll get you a new one," he promised, "a better one." Later that day, I was exploring the attic, a dusty, cavernous space filled with forgotten treasures. In a large cedar chest tucked away beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, I found it. It was a small, plain mirror with a simple wooden frame. It was nothing like my ornate silver one, but it was a mirror, and in a house that seemed to have been scrubbed clean of any reflective surface, it felt like a rare and valuable find. The second rule, "all mirrors are forbidden," flickered in my mind, but I pushed it away. It was such a strange, nonsensical rule. What harm could a little mirror do? I took it downstairs and hung it on the wall in our bedroom, opposite the large window. It was a small act of defiance, a way of claiming the space as our own. We were not going to be ruled by the strange whims of a dead woman. The mirror looked innocent enough, its surface reflecting the quiet, sunlit room. But as the day wore on, I started to notice things. A trick of the light, a flicker of movement at the edge of the reflection. I would glance up, and for a split second it would look as though the room in the mirror was not quite the same as the room I was standing in. The shadows would be a little longer, the colors a little duller. I told myself it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after the strange events of the first night. But a small, cold seed of unease had been planted. The house was watching us. And now we were watching it back. Sunday arrived with a strange sense of anticipation. The third rule, the one about Sunday supper, had felt the most bizarre, the most arbitrary. Sunday supper must be served at the dining table at 6 p.m. sharp. It was so specific, so demanding. We had talked about ignoring it, about letting this one slide. But a small, nagging part of me, the part that had been unsettled by the whispers and the broken mirror, insisted that we follow it. Just in case. The dining room was a grand, imposing space that we had avoided until now. A long, dark wood table, big enough to seat 20, dominated the room. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the chairs were still draped in their white shrouds. We spent the afternoon cleaning, the silence of the room broken only by the sound of our scrubbing and the rustle of the dust cloths. It felt like we were preparing for a royal feast, not a simple meal for two. As the clock in the hallway chimed 5, I started to cook. I made a simple roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, the kind of comforting, familiar meal that I hoped would chase away the growing sense of unease that had taken root in my heart. The smell of the roasting chicken filled the house, a warm, savory scent that seemed to push back against the cold, musty smell of the old wood and dust. At precisely 6 o'clock, we sat down at the enormous table. The two of us, at opposite ends of the long, polished surface, felt small and insignificant. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The windows were black, reflecting our own pale, nervous faces. We ate in silence, the clink of our forks against the plates loud in the stillness. The food was good, but I could barely taste it. My senses were on high alert, every nerve ending tingling with a strange, nervous energy. And then we heard it. A soft scraping sound. It was the sound of a chair being pulled out from the table. I looked at Liam, my eyes wide with a question I was too afraid to ask. He was staring at the head of the table, his face pale. The chair at the head of the table, the one that had been pushed in all day, was now pulled out, as if someone had just sat down. Then came another sound, the distinct, unmistakable clink of cutlery against an empty plate. It was a slow, deliberate sound, the sound of someone eating a meal with relish. But there was no one there. The chair was empty. The plate was empty. Yet the sounds continued, a ghostly echo of a meal being eaten by an unseen guest. We didn't speak. We didn't move. We just sat there, frozen in our chairs, listening to the phantom diner at the head of our table. The whispers started then, a low, hungry murmur that seemed to come from the empty chair itself. It was a sound of satisfaction, of a hunger being sated. We had followed the rule. We had served the supper, and something in the house was pleased. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. We weren't just living in the house, we were feeding it. The week after the first Sunday supper was quiet. The house seemed to be sleeping, digesting its meal. The whispers faded, and the strange sense of being watched lessened. We tried to fall back into our routine, to pretend that the phantom dinner party had just been a shared hallucination, a product of our stress and overactive imaginations. But the fear was still there, a low, humming current beneath the surface of our new life. We were walking on eggshells, careful not to disturb the sleeping giant. It was a few nights later that the first rule was broken. It was a stupid, simple mistake. A stray cat, a skinny, mangy thing with one eye, had been hanging around the porch. I had taken pity on it, leaving out a saucer of milk. That evening, as I was clearing up, the cat darted into the house through the open back door. I spent the next few minutes trying to coax it out, chasing it through the kitchen and the living room. Liam was in the shower, and I was so focused on the cat that I didn't notice the sun had set, the sky outside turning a deep, bruised purple. Finally, I managed to shoo the cat out the back door. I closed it, the click of the latch loud in the sudden silence. And then I realized my mistake. The door had been open for at least 10 minutes after sunset. A cold dread washed over me. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest, listening. At first, there was nothing. Just the sound of the water running upstairs, the gentle hum of the refrigerator. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was okay. Maybe a few minutes didn't matter. And then the whispers started. They were different this time. Louder, more distinct. Before, they had been a soft, sibilant murmur like the rustle of leaves. Now, they had a mocking, guttural edge. It sounded like laughter, a low, cruel chuckle that seemed to come from all around me. It was the sound of something that had been waiting patiently and was now delighted by our mistake. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the shadowy kitchen. The room, which had felt so warm and inviting just a few minutes before, now felt menacing, alien. The shadows seemed to deepen, to stretch and twist into unfamiliar shapes. The laughter grew louder, echoing in my ears, a chorus of unseen voices all laughing at my fear. Liam came downstairs a few minutes later, a towel wrapped around his waist. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "The door," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I left the door open." He didn't have to ask what I meant. He could hear it, too. The laughter. It was a sound that would haunt my dreams for weeks to come. It was the sound of a cage door being opened, and we were on the wrong side of it. The laughter eventually faded, but the silence it left behind was worse. It was a heavy, watchful silence, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. We didn't sleep that night. We lay in bed, side by side, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind was a new source of terror. The house was awake now, and it was angry. The next day, the real torment began. It started with the mirror, the small, plain mirror that I had hung in the bedroom, the one that had seemed so innocent. I was brushing my hair, my back to the mirror, when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the reflection. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I slowly turned to face the mirror, but there was nothing there. Just my own pale, frightened face staring back at me. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a symptom of my sleep-deprived mind. But it happened again, and again. A fleeting glimpse of a shadow in the background, a distorted face looking over my shoulder, a figure standing in the doorway of the reflection when I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no one there. It was always gone before I could get a good look, a split-second hallucination that left me questioning my own sanity. I told Liam about it, my voice trembling. He tried to be rational, to come up with logical explanations. It was the light from the window, the branches of the trees outside, the way the old glass distorted the reflection. He stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders, and we stared into the mirror together. "See," he said, his voice gentle. "There's nothing there, just us." But I could see it, over his shoulder, in the dim light of the room. A face was starting to form. It was a pale, gaunt face, with hollow eyes and a wide, lipless mouth that seemed to be stretched into a silent scream. It was the face of a woman who looked like she had been trapped in the dark for a very, very long time. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath catching in my throat. When I opened them again, it was gone. There was only our own reflection staring back at us with wide, terrified eyes. I wanted to smash the mirror, to tear it from the wall and shatter it into 1,000 pieces. But a part of me was afraid of what would happen if I did. The rules were not suggestions. They were a binding contract, and we had already broken one. What would happen if we broke another? The mirror was a window, a portal to somewhere else, and I was terrified of what might come through if I shattered the glass. So I did the only thing I could think of. I took the mirror down from the wall and locked it away in the attic, back in the dusty cedar chest where I had found it. But it was too late. I had seen the face in the mirror, and the face had seen me. The isolation of the farmhouse, which had once felt like a peaceful embrace, was now a suffocating weight. We were miles from anywhere, with no neighbors and no one to turn to. The nearest town, a small sleepy place called Havenwood, was a 20-minute drive away. We were running low on supplies, and the thought of leaving the house, even for a few hours, was a welcome relief. We needed to be around people, to be reminded that there was a world outside the four walls of our prison. The drive into town was a strange experience. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the world looked bright and normal. It was hard to believe that just a few miles away, our house was filled with whispers and shadows. As we drove down the main street of Havenwood, I felt a sense of hope flicker within me. Maybe we could get help. Maybe we could find someone who knew about the house, about its strange history, and its even stranger rules. We went to the local grocery store, a small, cluttered place with a friendly bell-over-the-door charm. The people were polite, but there was a wariness in their eyes when we told them where we were living. The friendly smiles would tighten, the easy conversation would become strained. They would nod, their eyes darting away, and find a reason to end the conversation. It was at the hardware store that the mask of politeness finally slipped. Liam was buying a new lock for the cellar door, a heavy, industrial-looking thing that he hoped would keep whatever was in the house out of that one specific room. The shopkeeper, a grizzled old man with a kind, weathered face, looked at the lock, then at Liam. "Having some trouble up at the old Vance place?" he asked, his voice low. Liam hesitated, then nodded. "You could say that." The old man sighed, a long, weary sound. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You mind the rules you hear?" he said, his eyes dark with a warning that went far beyond simple advice. "You mind them good. That house, it has a long memory, and it doesn't like to be disturbed." Before Liam could ask him what he meant, the old man straightened up, his face once again a mask of friendly indifference. He took Liam's money, his hand brushing against Liam's for a brief, chilling moment. His skin was as cold as ice. "You have a good day now," he said, his voice once again light and cheerful. But his eyes told a different story. They were filled with a deep, ancient fear, the fear of a man who had lived his whole life in the shadow of the house on the hill. We left the store, a new kind of dread settling over us. The people of Havenwood knew about the house. They knew about the rules, and they were terrified. We were not just isolated, we were quarantined. The town was not a source of help. It was a wall, a barrier between our world and theirs, and we were on the wrong side of it. The drive back to the farmhouse was silent. The cheerful music we had played on the way into town now seemed jarring, out of place. We were returning to our prison, and the walls felt like they were closing in. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a beautiful sunset, but all I could see was the approaching darkness, the coming of the night, and the things that came with it. As soon as we stepped inside the house, we could feel the change. The air was thick, heavy, and the silence was charged with a malevolent energy. The whispers started almost immediately, but they were different now. They were no longer just a soft, sibilant murmur. They were words, clear, distinct words spoken in a low, guttural voice that seemed to come from the very walls of the house, and they knew our names. "Chloe," the voice whispered, a long, drawn-out sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Liam." We froze in the hallway, our bags of groceries still in our hands. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, a disembodied sound that seemed to echo in our very bones. It was a voice that was ancient, filled with a cold, cruel amusement. The whispers followed us as we moved through the house, a constant, tormenting presence. They whispered secrets we had never told each other, things they had no way of knowing. They whispered about the fight Liam had with his boss before he quit his job, the one he had never told me about. They whispered about the small secret fear I had that I would never be good enough, a fear I had never even admitted to myself. They were trying to drive a wedge between us, to sow seeds of doubt and paranoia. They twisted our words, our memories, our fears, and used them as weapons against us. Liam would be in one room, and I would be in another, and the whispers would tell me that he was plotting against me, that he was going to leave me here alone. Then they would go to him and tell him the same things about me. We tried to fight it. We tried to talk to each other, to reassure each other that it was just the house, that it was trying to trick us. But the whispers were insidious, relentless. They wormed their way into our minds, into the small, dark corners of our hearts where our deepest fears and insecurities resided. The house was not just a physical prison. It was a psychological one. It was trying to break us down, to turn us against each other. And it was working. The trust that had been the bedrock of our relationship was beginning to crack. We were no longer a team. We were two frightened people, trapped in a house that was trying to devour us, one secret at a time. The constant, tormenting whispers were driving us to the edge of madness. We couldn't eat. We couldn't sleep. The house was a relentless psychological assault, and we were losing the battle. Liam, who had always been so calm and rational, was now a bundle of raw nerves. He paced the house like a caged animal, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and anger. He was determined to find the source of the whispers, to confront whatever it was that was haunting us. His obsession focused on the cellar. It was the one place in the house we hadn't explored, the one door that had remained stubbornly locked. The whispers seemed to be stronger near the cellar door, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to seep through the cracks in the wood. Liam became convinced that the source of our torment was locked away down there, in the dark, damp space beneath the house. He spent a whole afternoon working on the lock, his frustration growing with every failed attempt. The lock was old, rusted, but it refused to yield. Finally, in a fit of rage, he took a crowbar to the door, the shriek of splintering wood echoing through the silent house. The door flew open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into darkness. The air that billowed up from the cellar was cold and musty, with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sweet and cloying, like rotting flowers. Liam grabbed a flashlight, his face set with a grim determination. I begged him not to go down there, a cold, primal fear gripping me. But he was beyond listening to reason. He had to know what was down there. I waited at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as he descended into the darkness. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a small, stone-walled cellar. It was empty. There were no hidden chambers, no secret passages, just a bare, dirt floor and 4 damp stone walls. But then the beam of the flashlight fell on the far wall, and Liam let out a sharp, strangled gasp. I crept down the stairs, my fear warring with my need to know what he had seen. The wall was covered in scratches, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. They were tally marks carved into the stone with a desperate, frantic energy. It was a calendar of madness, a record of countless days spent in the dark. And in the center of the room, facing the wall of tally marks, was a single small wooden chair. It was a child's chair, small and plain, but it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It was a chair for an audience. A chair for someone who had been forced to sit and watch day after day as the world outside went on without them. The whispers in the cellar were different. They were not mocking or cruel. They were a soft, sorrowful sound, the sound of a child crying in the dark. We had not found the source of the house's evil. We had found its first victim. The discovery in the cellar changed everything. The house was no longer just a malevolent force. It was a place of profound sorrow, a place where something terrible had happened. The whispers no longer felt like a threat. They felt like a cry for help. We had stumbled into a tragedy, a story that was still being told, and we were now a part of it. The second Sunday supper arrived with a sense of grim inevitability. We knew we had to go through with it. The house demanded it. But this time, it felt different. We were not just humoring the whims of a dead woman. We were participating in a ritual, a ceremony that was far older and more significant than we could possibly understand. The dining room was even colder and more imposing than before. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of anticipation that was almost suffocating. We sat at the long, dark table, the silence broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing. We didn't even try to eat. The food sat on our plates, untouched, a silent offering to the unseen guest at the head of a table. At precisely 6 o'clock, the scraping sound of the chair began, followed by the clink of cutlery against the empty plate. But this time, there was something else. A new sound, a low, guttural rumbling like the sound of a hungry stomach. It was a sound of pure, insatiable hunger, and it seemed to come from the very walls of the house. Then, a glass of water on the table began to tremble. It slid, untouched, across the polished surface of the table, leaving a thin trail of condensation in its wake. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if pushed by an unseen hand. It reached the edge of the table, and then, with a final, decisive push, it toppled over, shattering on the floor with a sound that was deafening in the silence. The whisper started then, a chorus of hungry, demanding voices. They were no longer just in our heads. They were in the room with us, a tangible presence that we could feel against our skin. They were the voices of the hungry, the forgotten, the ones who had been left to starve in the dark. And they were demanding to be fed. We sat there, frozen in our chairs as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The house was not just a prison, it was a tomb. And the ghosts of its victims were still here, trapped within its walls, their hunger a constant gnawing presence. The Sunday supper was not a meal for one, it was a feast for the dead. And we were the main course. The terror of the second Sunday supper was a turning point. We couldn't go on like this. We couldn't live in a house that was actively trying to consume us. We had to understand what was happening, what we were up against. The next morning, we drove into Havenwood, not for supplies, but for answers. The town had a small, dusty library, and Liam was determined to find something, anything, that could explain the history of the house and the strange, tragic events that had unfolded within its walls. The library was a quiet, peaceful place, a world away from the chaos and terror of the farmhouse. The librarian, a kind-faced woman with a gentle smile, seemed happy to have visitors. She helped Liam find the local history section, a small collection of old leather-bound books and faded photographs. He spent hours poring over the records, his brow furrowed in concentration. I sat at a nearby table pretending to read a novel, but my eyes kept darting towards him, my heart filled with a desperate hope that he would find something, anything, that could save us. And then he did. It was a small, unassuming book, bound in dark green leather, with the title, A History of Havenwood and Its Environs, embossed in faded gold on the cover. He found a chapter on the old Vance property, the land that our farmhouse was built on. The book described the house as a place of great sorrow, a place that had been touched by tragedy time and time again. It told the story of the first family to live there, the Hales, who had built the house in the late 1800s. They had a young daughter, Emily, who had died of a mysterious illness. The book described how the family had become reclusive after her death, how they had withdrawn from the community, their grief a palpable presence that seemed to hang over the house like a shroud. Then it told the story of the next family, the Millers, who had inherited the house in the early 1900s. They too had a young daughter, Sarah, who had vanished without a trace. The town had searched for weeks, but she was never found. The Millers had left the house soon after, their hearts broken, their families shattered. And so it went on, a litany of tragedy and loss, each family that had lived in the house meeting with some terrible fate. The book didn't offer any explanations, any supernatural theories. It just presented the facts, a cold, hard record of the house's dark history. But the final entry, the one about our great-aunt Alara Vance, was the most chilling of all. It was a short, simple sentence, written in a different hand from the rest of the text, as if added as an afterthought. The family was lost, it read, after failing to observe the traditions of the house. Liam closed the book, his face pale. The traditions, the rules. They were not just the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. They were a part of the house's history, a set of instructions for survival that had been passed down from one family to the next. And we had broken them. The house was not just haunted, it was a predator, and it had a long, bloody history of devouring the families that lived within its walls. The knowledge that the house was a predator, that it had a history of devouring families, did not make us safer. It only made the terror more acute. We were no longer just fighting a ghost. We were fighting a legacy, a curse that had been woven into the very fabric of the house. And the house, it seemed, was tired of playing games. The mirror was the first to show the change. I had locked it away in the attic, but its presence still lingered in the house, a cold, watchful eye that I could feel even when I wasn't in the room. One afternoon, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I went up to the attic. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old memories. I opened the cedar chest, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror was there, just as I had left it, but the reflection was different. The face of the gaunt, hollow-eyed woman was clearer now, more defined. She was no longer just a fleeting glimpse, a trick of the light. She was a constant presence, a permanent resident of the world behind the glass. And she was smiling at me, a slow, cruel smile that did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were filled with a cold, ancient hunger. And then she spoke to me, not with the whispers of the house, but with a clear, distinct voice that seemed to echo in my mind. "I can help you," she said, her voice a soft, seductive murmur. "I can give you everything you've ever wanted, a life of peace, of comfort, no more debt, no more fear. All you have to do is let me in." I slammed the lid of the chest shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice followed me, a constant, tempting whisper in my ear. It promised me an escape from the nightmare we were living in, a way out of the prison the house had become. All I had to do was say yes. All I had to do was open the door. I knew it was a trick. I knew it was the house, the entity, whatever it was, trying to manipulate me, to break me down. But the offer was so tempting. The thought of a life without fear, without the constant gnawing terror that had become our new reality, was a powerful lure. The house was not just trying to scare us anymore. It was trying to seduce us. It was offering us a deal, a bargain. And I was terrified that a part of me, the part that was so tired of fighting, so desperate for a way out, was starting to consider it. The voice from the mirror haunted me. It was a constant presence, a seductive whisper in the back of my mind, promising me an escape that I knew was a lie. I tried to ignore it, to push it away, but it was always there, a constant reminder of the house's power, its ability to get inside my head. Liam saw the toll it was taking on me. He saw the dark circles under my eyes, the way I would jump at every sound, the way my hands would tremble when I thought no one was looking. He knew that the house was winning, that it was slowly breaking me down. And he decided that he had to do something drastic. One evening, as the sun was beginning to set, he went up to the attic. I heard him moving around up there, the sound of heavy objects being shifted. Then I heard a loud, splintering crash. I ran to the bottom of the attic stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. "Liam," I called out, my voice trembling. He appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale but resolute. In his hands he held the small, plain mirror, or what was left of it. The wooden frame was shattered, and the glass was a spiderweb of cracks. "It's over," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and relief. "I'm not going to let it do this to you. To us." The moment the words left his mouth, a deafening bang echoed through the house. It was the sound of a door being thrown open, and then another, and another. One by one, every door in the house flew open with a violent, explosive force. The front door, the back door, the cellar door, the doors to every room, every closet. They all flew open at once as if kicked in by an unseen army. And then the screaming started. It was not the whispers, not the laughter. It was a collective, agonized scream that seemed to come from the very foundation of the farmhouse. It was a sound of pure, undiluted rage, the sound of a creature that had been contained and was now, finally, free. The house, which had been so still and silent just a moment before, was now a whirlwind of chaotic energy. The lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The air grew cold, a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into our very bones. The house was no longer just a predator. It was a storm, and we were trapped in the eye of it. We had broken the rules, we had shattered the pact, and now we were about to face the consequences. The house was alive. It throbbed with a malevolent energy, a palpable presence that filled every corner of every room. The screaming had subsided, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the farmhouse. The air was thick with a cloying, sweet smell, like rotting meat and old flowers, a scent that made my stomach churn. We huddled together in the living room, Liam holding me tight, his body trembling. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of lightning outside the windows, illuminating the skeletal trees that surrounded the house. The shadows danced and writhed, taking on grotesque, impossible shapes. They darted at the edge of our vision, fleeting glimpses of something that was not quite human, not quite animal. Objects began to move. A vase on the mantelpiece slid to the floor with a crash. A painting on the wall tilted, then fell, its glass shattering. The old handcrafted furniture groaned and creaked as if struggling against an unseen force. It was a poltergeist, a violent, destructive energy that was tearing the house apart, piece by piece. And then the cold spots started. They were not just drafts, not just pockets of cold air. They were distinct, localized areas of intense, unnatural cold, as if something had just passed through them. They moved through the room, swirling around us, touching us with icy fingers. I could feel them on my skin, a chilling caress that made my teeth chatter. The whispers returned, but they were no longer just words. They were a cacophony of voices, a chorus of screams and moans and guttural growls. They were the voices of the house's victims, the ones who had been lost, the ones who had been consumed. They were the voices of the hungry, and they were demanding to be fed. We knew with a chilling certainty that the rules were not suggestions. They were a binding contract, a fragile shield that had protected us from the true nature of the house. And we had shattered it. The house was no longer just a place where strange things happened. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous being that had been awakened by our defiance. It was a predator, and we were its prey, and it was coming for us. The terror was no longer psychological, it was physical, and it was inescapable. The house was a maelstrom of chaos, a living nightmare. We were trapped with no escape, no hope. The physical manifestations of the entity were relentless, a constant assault on our senses. We knew we couldn't fight it head on. We had to find a way to understand it, to find its weakness. Our only hope lay in the past, in the history of the house, and the secrets it held. Liam, despite his fear, was still thinking clearly. He remembered the cellar, the tally marks on the wall, the small wooden chair. He remembered the old man in Havenwood, his warning about the house's long memory. He believed that the answers, if they existed, would be found there, in the dark, damp space beneath the house. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one we had. We crept down into the cellar, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The whispers were louder here, a mournful chorus that seemed to emanate from the very stones. The tally marks on the wall seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. Liam ran his hand over the rough stone, his fingers tracing the desperate scratches. "There has to be something," he muttered, his voice hoarse with fear. "Something more." He started tapping on the walls, listening for a hollow sound, a hidden space. I joined him, our hands moving over the cold, damp stone, a desperate search for a secret that might save us. And then I found it. A loose stone just behind the small wooden chair. It was almost perfectly camouflaged, a part of the wall, but when I pressed on it, it gave way, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded, brittle cloth, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, very old, its pages yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was spidery and faded, but it was legible. It was the journal of Ilara Vance, our great-aunt, the last known resident of the farmhouse. My hands trembled as I opened it, a sense of profound dread and desperate hope warring within me. The journal was a chilling account of her life in the house, a slow descent into madness and terror. She wrote about the whispers, the phantom sounds, the faces in the mirror. She wrote about the rules, not as eccentricities, but as a desperate attempt to keep the entity at bay. She called it the hunger, a parasitic entity that fed on misery and fear, a creature that had been trapped within the walls of the house for centuries. She wrote about the Sunday supper, not as a meal, but as a ritual of appeasement, a way to sate the hunger, to keep it from consuming them entirely. She wrote about the tally marks in the cellar, a record of the days she had spent trapped, a desperate attempt to hold on to her sanity. And then, on the last page, in a hand that was barely legible, she wrote about a way to fight back, a way to weaken the hunger, to bind it once more. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was a plan. We were no longer just victims. We were fighters, and we had a weapon. The journal was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness of the house. It was a terrifying read, a testament to Ilara Vance's suffering, but it also contained the key to our survival. The hunger, as she called it, was not just a ghost or a poltergeist. It was an ancient parasitic entity, bound to the house, feeding on the fear and misery of its inhabitants. The rules were not arbitrary. They were a complex ritual, a delicate balance that kept the hunger contained, sated, and dormant. And the Sunday supper was the most crucial part of that ritual. Ilara's spidery handwriting detailed the preparation for the supper, not as a meal for a guest, but as an offering, a binding spell. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the intent, the specific ingredients, the way it was presented. She wrote about certain herbs from the garden, plants that grew wild around the property, that had properties that could weaken the hunger, make it more susceptible to being bound. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was our only chance. We spent the next few days preparing. The house was still a maelstrom of chaos, but now, instead of cowering in fear, we moved with a grim determination. The shadows still danced, the cold spots still swirled, and the whispers still tormented us, but they felt less potent, less terrifying. We had a purpose now, a fight to win. We were no longer just victims, we were keepers preparing for a battle. Liam, with his practical mind, took charge of gathering the herbs. He found them growing in the overgrown garden, just as Ilara had described, a bitter-smelling root that looked like gnarled fingers, a cluster of pale, almost translucent berries, and a leafy plant with thorns that seemed to prick the air around it. He carefully dug them up, his hands shaking slightly, but his eyes filled with a fierce resolve. I focused on the meal itself. It had to be perfect, a precise replication of Ilara's instructions. The roast chicken, the potatoes, the carrots, all prepared with a meticulous attention to detail. But this time, we added the herbs, grinding the root into a fine powder and sprinkling it over the chicken, crushing the berries into the gravy and weaving the thorny leaves into a wreath around the serving platter. The smell was strange, a mix of savory and bitter, but it felt right. It felt like we were finally taking control. As Sunday approached, the house seemed to sense our intent. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, trying to sow discord, to make us doubt ourselves. They whispered about our past failures, our deepest insecurities, trying to break our resolve, but we held firm. We had each other, and we had Ilara's journal. We had a plan. This was not just a meal, it was a confrontation. And we were ready. The dining room was bathed in the pale, sickly light of the full moon. The air was thick with the scent of the herbs, a bitter, earthy smell that seemed to cling to everything. We sat at the long, dark table, the roast chicken steaming on the platter between us. The chairs were no longer draped in white shrouds. They were bare, waiting. We had set a place at the head of the table, a single plate, a knife and a fork, an invitation to our unseen guest. At precisely 6 o'clock, the scraping sound began. It was louder this time, more deliberate, as if the chair was being pulled out by a physical hand. Then came the clink of cutlery, a slow, rhythmic sound that filled the silence. We held our breath, our eyes fixed on the empty chair. The air grew cold, a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the head of the table, and then it appeared. It coalesced from the shadows, a swirling mass of darkness that slowly began to take shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, skeletal limbs that seemed to stretch and contort in the dim light. Its head was a featureless void, but I could feel its eyes on us, two burning points of malevolent energy. It was the hunger, the parasitic entity that had tormented this house for centuries, and it was here, at our table, an uninvited guest at our final supper. It didn't speak with whispers. It spoke with a voice that was clear, distinct, and chillingly familiar. It was the voice of the house's last victim, the voice of Alara Vance. "You have broken the rules," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the farmhouse. "You have defied me, and now you will pay." It reached out a long, skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws, and pointed at the roast chicken. "You offer me food?" it sneered, its voice dripping with contempt. "You think this will appease me?" Liam, his voice trembling but firm, spoke. "It is an offering," he said, his eyes fixed on the creature. "A binding. We re-accept the rules. We will be the keepers. We will feed you. But you will be bound." The hunger laughed, a dry, rattling sound that was devoid of humor. "You think you can bind me?" it hissed. "I am ancient. I am eternal. I am the hunger." "You are bound to this house," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "and we are the masters of this house. We will feed you, but you will obey." The creature hesitated, its featureless head tilting to one side. It seemed to sense the power of our words, the strength of our resolve. It was weakened by the herbs, its power diminished. It was still a formidable foe, but it was no longer invincible. It was a predator, but we were no longer just its prey. We were its masters. And the battle for the house had just begun. The hunger's form flickered, its shadowy outline wavering as if caught in a strong wind. The herbs were working. Its voice, once so clear and commanding, now had a strained, reedy quality like a dying breath. It was still powerful, still terrifying, but it was no longer in control. We had seized the reins, and it knew it. "A bargain," it rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers and groans. "You wish to bargain with me? You, who are but fleeting shadows in my eternal existence." Liam, his hand finding mine under the table, squeezed it tight. His voice was stronger now, filled with a newfound authority. "We are not shadows," he said, his eyes fixed on the wavering form of the entity. "We are the keepers, and we offer you a choice. You can continue to fight, to consume, to destroy, until there's nothing left but dust and echoes. Or you can accept our terms, you can be fed, you can be sated, but you will be bound." The hunger's form solidified for a moment, its featureless head turning slowly from Liam to me. It was studying us, weighing its options. It was a creature of pure instinct, driven by an insatiable hunger. But it was also ancient, and it understood the concept of survival. It had been bound before. It could be bound again. "What are your terms?" it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the farmhouse. It was a challenge, a test. It was trying to find a weakness, a crack in our resolve. "The rules," I said, my voice clear and steady. "The rules that Alara Vance laid down. The rules that have kept you contained for centuries. We will observe them. We will honor them. We will feed you every Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp. We will keep the doors closed after sunset. We will keep the mirrors hidden, and we will not listen to your whispers." The hunger's form wavered again, its shadowy limbs stretching and contracting as if in agony. It was a creature of chaos, of freedom, and the thought of being bound, of being controlled, was anathema to its very nature. But the hunger was a powerful force, a constant gnawing presence that had driven it for centuries, and the herbs were weakening it, making it desperate. "And what do I gain?" it rasped, its voice barely a whisper. "What do I gain from this servitude?" "Survival," Liam said, his voice firm. "You gain survival. You gain sustenance. You gain a home. And you gain peace, the peace of being sated, of being contained, of no longer being driven by an endless, gnawing hunger." The hunger was silent for a long moment, its shadowy form flickering in the dim light. It was a creature of immense power, but it was also a creature of habit. It had been bound before. It understood the cycle, and it was tired. The battle had been long, and it had been losing. Finally, with a sound that was half sigh, half groan, it began to recede. Its shadowy form dissolved, melting back into the walls, into the very fabric of the house. The cold spots lessened, the whispers faded, and the oppressive weight in the air began to lift. The house was still, but it was a different kind of stillness. It was the stillness of a predator that had been fed, a beast that had been tamed. We had made our bargain, and for now, the house was ours. The house was quiet, a deep, profound quiet that settled over us like a heavy blanket. The whispers were gone, the cold spots had vanished, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air for weeks had lifted. It was over. We had won. We had faced the hunger, and we had bound it. But the victory was not sweet. It was tinged with a grim, unsettling reality. We were the new caretakers. The house was ours, but it was also our prison. We were bound to it, just as the hunger was bound to it. We had to maintain the rules, to perform the rituals, to feed the beast that lived within our walls. Every Sunday, at 6 p.m. sharp, we would prepare the meal, adding the bitter herbs, and we would sit at the long, dark table, waiting for our unseen guest. We would close every door after sunset, and we would keep the mirrors hidden, and we would never, ever listen to the whispers. The first few weeks were a strange adjustment. The house felt different, lighter, but the memory of what we had faced lingered like a phantom limb. We found ourselves jumping at shadows, flinching at every creak of the floorboards. The peace we had fought so hard for was a fragile thing, constantly threatened by the knowledge of what lay dormant beneath our feet. We tried to live a normal life. We went into Havenwood for supplies, and the townspeople, sensing a change, were less wary, more open. But we knew their smiles were superficial, their kindness a thin veneer over a deep-seated fear. They knew about the house, they always had, and now they knew we were the ones who kept the beast at bay. Our relationship had changed too. The fear had forged us, had stripped away the superficial layers and revealed the raw, vulnerable core of our love. We were stronger, more connected, but also more scarred. We had faced death together, and it had left an indelible mark. We rarely spoke of what had happened, the words too heavy, too real, but the unspoken understanding between us was a constant presence, a silent testament to the horrors we had endured. As the months turned into a year, the routine became second nature. The Sunday supper was no longer a terrifying confrontation, but a solemn duty. The house was still, the hunger sated, but we knew it was always there, waiting, watching, a constant reminder of our bargain. We had traded our old life for a new one, a life of quiet vigilance, of endless responsibility. We had gotten the farmhouse for free, but the cost was our freedom. We were the keepers of the house, the guardians of the hunger. And we would be for the rest of our lives. The story ends with Liam and Chloe preparing for the next Sunday's supper, the grim reality of their free farmhouse stretching out before them for the rest of their lives. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the dining room. The air is still, expectant. The house is waiting, and so are they. They are trapped in a permanent cycle of vigilance, their lives forever intertwined with the ancient entity they have bound. The silence is broken only by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant, almost imperceptible sound of a low, guttural rumbling, a sound that only they can hear. The hunger is stirring, and it is almost time to feed.